Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Asha Kothari Chaudhary and I'm Professor of English at Guwahati University. The course we are looking at is Indian Writing in English, and the module we are going to look at today is called Treatment of Nature in Indian English Poetry of the Pre-Independence and Post-Independence Era. We will be looking at three specific poets today: the work of Toru Dutt, the work of Sarojini Naidu, and the work of Keki Daruwalla. We have to understand that nature as a subject matter becomes an extremely important phenomenon in English writing of the period that we normally refer to as the Romantic period in English literature. Nature assumes a tremendous kind of influence and affects the very body of poetry in the English canon. In Indian writing in English, in the poetry particularly, we find that many of the poets who were writing particularly in the 19th century became influenced heavily by the works of the English Romantic poets such as John Keats and Wordsworth and Lord Byron. And you will find that these are influences that we will be tracking, particularly in the works of Toru Dutt and Sarojini Naidu. Poetry of the post-independence era refers to nature in a slightly different manner, particularly as we will see in the work of Keki Daruwalla. His poetry is informed now by a sensibility that is very distinctively post-colonial and references the life and times of our contemporary Indian spaces. Let us first look at Toru Dutt. Toru Dutt was born in 1856 in Calcutta, which was then a province of India, of course, and she remained in Calcutta until 1869. And she was a very much traveled person, visiting places like France, Italy, England with her sister, Toru Dutt. Toru Dutt is a proficient linguist in some sense, having a fluency in the languages of her home in terms of Bengali or Hindustani. Her education is in English, and then she learns French. In fact, her first volume of poems was originally composed in French, and later she translated it into English, calling it A Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields. Although having received a British upbringing, Toru Dutt vehemently criticized the British imperial policy. Her works include Bianca or The Young Spanish Maiden in 1878, Le Journal de Mademoiselle d'Evreux in 1879, and Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan, which comes in 1882. Edmund Goss once commented that when the history of the literature of our country comes to be written, there is sure to be a page in it dedicated to this fragile, exotic blossom of song. This in reference to Toru Dutt. The first poem that we are looking at now is her very, very well known Our Casuarina Tree. The poem is crafted much in the manner of English Romantic poetry, which also serves to highlight the tremendous impact it exerted on the early Indian poets. The poem begins with a powerful smile of a python, which is compared with that of the creepers that climb around the bulk of the tree. The reader is bound to find some kind of intertextual reference with Hardy's The Darkling Thrush. The poet tries to allocate a pride of place to nature parallel to a great saga of human evolution. In one sense, the Casuarina tree acts as a mother. The poet is overcome by a deep sense of yearning for her childhood. The idea of pain is bolstered by the choice of diction like lament, wail, dirge, which includes the psychological state of the poet in retrieving memories of childhood. The Casuarina tree stands for nature. It is a microcosm of a macrocosm. The Casuarina tree becomes a symbol of regeneration, heightens the poetic sensibility of the poet, and in a sense, the tree becomes a classic obsession of the poet due to the magnitude of the psychological impact. The tree is visualized as an agent so powerful that even death could not dare to touch this. This idea of empowering the tree is unique, and herein lies one of the unique aspects of Dutt's treatment of nature. Our next poet, who refers to nature in almost all of her works, is Sarojini Naidu, who was born in February 13, 1878 in Hyderabad. She hails from a family of academicians and scientists, and her father, Dr. Aghooranath Chattopadhyay, was a scientist himself and the founder of the Nizam College of Hyderabad, while her mother was the Varasundari, an accomplished Bengali poet. In the King's College, she met Govind Naidu, who she married at the age of 19. Naidu's vast readings and the inspirations from her father made her well versed in Hindu mythology, in Urdu and Persian folklore. While in Cambridge, as a student, she published her first poem, The Song of a Dream, and she was highly, at this point of time, influenced by the English romantic poets like Byron and Keats. It is in England that she comes under the influence of her literary mentors, people as well known as Arthur Symons and Edmund Gosse, who make it a point to give her an identity which would endear her to her land of origin. We soon find that the early streak of English Romanticism that is so heavily there in her poetry diminishes and becomes substituted by more indigenous themes concerning Indian life. It was in fact her correspondence with Mahatma Gandhi, whom she called Mickey Mouse of Indian politics, along with the gruesome picture of Indian colonial situation, that transformed her completely from a romantic singer of life's beautiful peculiarities to a determined and impassioned fighter for her country's liberation. Her published works include The Golden Threshold, which came in 1905. It was followed by subsequent publications of The Bird of Time, The Broken Wings, The Magic Trees, The Wizard Mask, and A Treasury of Poems. She is therefore a prolific writer, because she is now plunging headlong into the vortex of the Indian national freedom struggle. The publication of The Broken Wing in 1917 comes and refers greatly to this particular phase in Indian history. The idea of sensuality is quite profound, as the crux of the poem is built on the principle of a reciprocal relation between nature and the human world. Naidu's deep sense of romanticism tallies force with her preoccupation with nature, as reflected in the expressions such as wakening skies, or winds that lie asleep in the arms of the dawn like a child, or leaping wealth of the tide, or a phrase like kiss of the spray and the dance of the wild foam's glee, and so on. The poem is craftily set with a panoramic clarity that gives the reader a deep sense of empathy. Expressions like coconut glade, or the scent of the mango grove, or the dance of the wild foam not only highlights the sensuousness of nature, but also establishes the serenity of the panorama being witnessed. In Praise of Henna is the poem where Naidu talks about the Indian traditional ritual of adorning the hands and the feet of the bride with the henna, or the mehendi. The act of grinding henna in mortars is something that is intrinsically related to the Indian herbal science of the Ayurveda. The poem as such can be seen to be both a celebration of Indian rituals as well as a glorification of a herbal science that has long been the guard of honor of Indian medical science as well. Sarojini Naidu's dexterous use of contrast vindicates the dichotomy of gender which is highlighted in the use of the striking metaphors of betel nuts red for the lips that are sweet and tilkas red for the brow of a bride. While the adjectival phrase betel nuts red denotes the qualitative standard of the male habituated to chewing pan, the redness of the tilka and the lily-like fingers and feet demonstrates the fragility of the female. The title, therefore, justifiably suits the exigencies of Indian marriages and also throws significant light on the importance of nature in the daily drama of human life. We now move on across 1947 into an independent India where the sensibility is completely different. We have the work of Keki Daruwalla, who was born in 1937 but begins his working life as a poet only in a post-colonial India, setting a tone which is completely different now and completely self-aware in terms of its post-coloniality and referencing all sorts of things that come with a newly independent country. Now, Daruwalla is someone who is actually a police officer by profession, who has simultaneously managed to pursue the creative art of poetry. Having published 12 volumes of poetry, he is an extremely prolific poet and writer, among which some of his very well-known works are Under Orion, Winter Poems, Landscapes, Summer of Tigers, and so on. And it is, I think, his latest book is The Glass Blower, Selected Poems that came out in the year 2008. Daruwalla believes in a subjective response of the poet in producing a work of art, and he says that poetry for him is first personal, exploratory, and at times even therapeutic, and helps to come to terms with one's interior world. The poem called Gulzaman Sun has Daruwalla, through his poetic persona, sketching an unusually appealing picture of human life and solidarity. Unusual because most of his poems are not expressive of a solidarity or belief in humankind. But in this poem, you have Daruwalla treating nature in terms of a fine mixture of emotional vitality and practical necessity. And it is this idea that brands him as a quintessentially a nature poet. Daruwalla is known again for his exceptional ability to describe scenes and landscapes in absolutely great, minute detail. In this poet, Daruwalla refers to the adult female sheep to symbolically represent nature. Gulzaman's love is intensified due to the merciless onslaughts of society against his reproductive infertility or childlessness. In a sense, his love for the Eve can be seen as the only possible solace and a deliberate strategy to avoid such bitter criticism of his potency. Gulzaman's efforts to rehabilitate himself by associating with his hue adequately highlights the degree of his agonies. Daruwalla delineates nature that has turned against human life, be that of the humans or of the animals. The emotive rendering of their ewes, snuggling and pleating, a quote, thin tremolo of love that is blanketed by gutturals of pain, not only unveils Daruwalla's adept handling of the foreign lexicon and diction, but also brings forth the human element in Gulzaman, which is ironically missing in the society in which he truly belongs. In Wolf, Daruwalla's explicit concern is crafted around the mythical significance of the wolf image that is normally used by parents to control the behavior of their children. The poem apparently creates a Blakean atmosphere that is evident in the famous poem Tiger by William Blake. The image of the wolf in the poem is not just a celebration of nature, but is in a sense a glowing reminder of the indifference of nature, which also happens to nurture such creatures. The psychical complex thus generated would have a negative impact in the mental growth of the child. The fear of the fox or the snake, the long one as it is referred to in our society, especially during the night, generates a negative response in the child with which he or she has to constantly struggle with. Now, the speaker's poignant awareness of the slaughtering of the wolves, as indicated by the horrid image of the hedge smoking with gun barrels, conveys the atrocity inflicted not only on the wolves but on nature. Suddenly the Tree is the poem that is crafted in response to the enormity of damage that human lives have brought upon nature. The poem begins with a comparison between the inert nature of the beehive, which is suggestive from the word slept, with that of Argus, which is a large, long-tailed bird with generally brown plumage, especially found in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. The idea of mysticism is equally potent as it highlights one quintessential feature of Indian mysticism, which always seems to harmonize in a fine blend with nature. This is due to the fact that the Indian philosophers have always seen in nature the potential to uplift and rejuvenate the essential human nature, which is normally characterized by morbidity, senile decay, vacuity, or purposelessness. The pain and the agony of losing one's home is vividly brought out in the case of the bees, when the speaker mentions that they were reluctant to let go of their abode. The ecological stand of the poem also becomes profound as the speaker describes how the sparrows and the squirrels fed themselves on the remains of the hive, quite oblivious to what had caused such disorder in the first place. The poem is not just a statement on the gargantuan rift caused in nature by the mean-mindedness of human beings, but is essentially about nature compensating her loss. So when we talked about three poets focusing on their specific poems, we looked at post and pre-independence Indian poets who are expressing themselves in English, who are writing about nature. So what is so specific and interesting and different about this particular twin types of writing nature in Indian English poetry? How are the pre-independence poets like Sarojini Naidu or Toru Dutt different from the ones that we have in post-independence India? How is the sensibility different? What influences are now different? Now, these are things that we as students of this particular phase of Indian writing need to focus upon and try to analyze in terms of the specific historical referentialities that are made available to us through our understanding of history and ideological underpinnings as well. When we're thinking of Toru Dutt particularly, or Sarojini Naidu later on, we find that both of them are women. That's an interesting factor because we also need to bring in the idea of gender in our understanding of how it works, particularly in reference to women poets. Having said that, if we again think back to the fact that both these women poets writing in the 19th and maybe a little bit in the early 20th centuries are very well-traveled women and very well-educated women who have been consistently at Britain and other parts of the world, to France for Toru Dutt. You have these very important inputs that seem to come into their poetry that makes it very distinctively different from the work of any of the male writers who are writing at this point of time in the 19th century, with or without reference to the idea of nature. But the fact that both these women poets tend to write in terms of and with reference to nature makes it extremely significant. And there are specific kinds of questions that we need to perhaps address at certain points of time. For example, how is the concept of the family working in a poem like the Coromandel Fishers? How does Naidu, Sarojini Naidu, work out a fine fusion between nature and the human world? How does she reflect on the dichotomy of gender? What are the expressions that are used to convey this difference? It is important for us as students of poetry of this era to look at the poems themselves and do a close reading in order to arrive at our conclusions. Also, backing it up with a solid contextual reference point in terms of historicity and other relevant material. So you have, on the one hand, pre-independence Indian poetry writers who are referring to nature, and we have considered two poets in that phase, both of who are women, and move now to Keki Daruwalla in the second half of what we have learned today in our analysis of several poems by Keki Daruwalla. Now, Daruwalla's referencing of his own life history in terms of violence that he seems to perceive in his role as a police officer seems to feed into a great deal of what he is articulating in his poetry. And much of the landscape that we find in Daruwalla's poetry emanates from a very starkly, a very raw kind of materiality that would emanate from a very violent background. And this probably is a reference to his own first-hand dealings with nature in terms of violence. In so many ways, violence is a kind of benchmark through which one would say he enters into the work of nature and the perpetration of violence that speaks through nature or subverts it. Having said all of these are again important questions that we will try and keep in mind when we are thinking of nature as a specific thematic entry point into Indian writing in English and poetry in English. Thank you.